So the profits are going offshore, the gas is going offshore, there's few jobs, there's few royalties, there's few taxes. The economic contribution...
For the federal election in the state, we have 3 independents.
Or who I support, or I don't like to endorse political parties or politicians because A, I'm trying to focus on the issues and not get too caught up in the kind of political ins and outs. But B, I know that as soon as I do that, it will turn some people off who might otherwise actually be interested in my ideas.
What are the 3 things they should be looking for?
But ask them, what will you do to stand up to the oil and gas industry? That's a pretty big question, I think. Party of free markets to be saying, oh, we want to build these publicly owned nuclear reactors. I don't think they're serious. And I think that they're using that as a way to say, oh yeah, further down the road, we'll sort out nuclear power. For now, let's just keep going with the gas industry. Let's keep giving them whatever they want. Let's keep letting them expand.
Who is running the country?
Who is running the country? Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, yeah, those groups all have some degree of power, right? That firm, which they outsourced the election to, made donations, fairly large donations, to the WA Labor Party in the last year or so.
Welcome, Gerard. How are you?
I'm well. Dev, how are you?
Doing very well, and thanks for the time today.
My pleasure.
You run this channel on multiple socials called Big State.
That's right.
And then you do a lot of reporting and a few podcasts and a lot of political interviews you have done. But before we go there, could you talk a bit more and give us a bit of an idea of what you are, what you do, and a bit of a backdrop?
Sure. I mean, I these days largely seem to make stuff for the internet, create content for TikTok. As Big State, as you mentioned, I run a newsletter/podcast called The Last Place on Earth. And both of those, I guess, are about uncovering what's going on in Western Australia and uncovering some of the ways in which our political system is captured by big, powerful interests. You know, obviously conspiracy theories are a big thing these days, but I actually think you don't have to go to all these kind of out there and wacky things about lizard people or tinfoil hats and pizza parlours and whatnot. The real conspiracy is right in front of our face. It is the way that big corporate business interests, including the oil and gas industry, including property developers, have a real hold over government in Australia, but especially government in Western Australia. So that's kind of my main focus these days, is trying to shine a light on some of that.
Could you tell us a bit more on the journey why did you landed in doing what you're doing?
Sure.
Your growing up and then what was important for you as you grow up and then your first job, and talk through that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, look, I grew up in Bunbury, so Bunbury, Western Australia. What was important to me then was the place around me was really important. You know, I grew up kind of playing in the bush and going to the beach in kind of, I think, the last era where kids were allowed to roam freely. Like, I grew up in that time, and I think that kind of, I was at the tail end of that. And that was really important to me because it gave me a sense of love and appreciation for the place that I lived. And I guess another thing that was always important to me growing up was this idea of a fair go. And that's an idea which is kind of fundamental to, I think, the Australian character, is the idea of a fair go. But we hear less and less of it. It's something that I think we're perhaps forgetting as Australians, is the importance of a fair go. But that was always important to me, and I think you can see a through line from that to what I'm doing now. I was a high school teacher for 5 years, an English teacher. I really enjoyed that. Liked working with young people, found that very inspiring, seeing intelligent young people. Got fairly frustrated with the education system. I think that it wasn't, the education system wasn't letting young people fulfill their full potential. And so I had some frustration there, decided I wanted to do other things. Since then I've been doing some writing, some campaigning, new media stuff, trying my hands at all different things. I was a radio producer in the Pilbara for a couple of years. So, I just kind of tend to take life where it takes me, and it's taken me to some fairly interesting places so far, I think. So, yeah.
You talked about the education system. Could you also lay the land in terms of, is education system working for the new age skills? Is the education system working in terms of teaching you the critical skills of problem solving, critical thinking, all those things with an aptitude, including an aptitude skills, so that, and are they preparing our younger people for the challenges of work? And if they want to achieve something off the norm, not the normal.
I think the short answer is no, the education system is not working. I think that young people, especially nowadays, need to be empowered to follow what they're passionate about and to learn those important skills that you're talking about. But the education system is stuck in the 19th century. It's this factory model of education where we're just trying to pump out students who have particular knowledge, trying to fill them up with knowledge like they're, piggy banks that we're putting coins in. That's just not how learning works. And especially in this age where information is not in short supply, the information we need is at our fingertips. There's a lot of bad information out there as well, which is a separate problem. But I don't think the education system is really working for anyone, and I don't think it's sustainable. In Western Australia, we have massive teacher shortages because it's not working for teachers. So many school kids are refusing to go to school or are not enjoying school, that it's not an inspiring place for them to be. I saw kids coming in year 7, year 8, enthusiastic, intelligent, inspired. By the time those same kids were in year 11 and 12, they were so disenchanted. It was almost like they'd taken a bit of a step backwards. They were less engaged, and I just thought, something has gone wrong here. Then COVID came. I thought COVID was going to be a great thing for schools because all of a sudden we were being told as teachers, your most important job is to look after these kids and make sure they're okay emotionally. To me, that was fantastic. You can only learn if you're in a good space to learn. We were also being told, don't worry so much about these tests, just worry about making sure these kids learn something. To me as well, that was a fantastic thing. I thought, great, this is going to change education. But instead, what happened is that as soon as things kind of went back to normal, it swung back the other way. We had more assessments. We had more kind of extrinsic motivation. We had more of the kind of administrative grind that was taking up so much of the school day, both for students and for teachers. It wasn't leaving the space to develop people as whole people, all parts of them.
So you would assume the more assessments and more focus on the education of literacy and numeracy skills should increase the scorings, but our average scores on literacy and numeracy skills have gone down in comparison to other OECD countries.
That's right, at the same time as we are increasing the amount that we assess. And I think there's a very simple answer to that, which is, when in your life have you learned something? Is it because you're interested and want to do it and it's useful to you? Or is it because someone's telling you have to do it to tick a box? It's the first, right? The assessments become assessments for the sake of assessment. There's no clear value to why they're doing that. We learn things because we either need to or because we're interested. We all need things, we're all interested in things. Schools need to encourage that. I'm not saying let's create schools that are just a free-for-all where there's no structure at all. That's also foolish. But I think that the model that we are using now is a 19th century model, modelled on the factories of England during the Industrial Revolution. It's not a 21st century model for education for our digital age, and kids are becoming increasingly alienated because of that. And young people today have a lot of problems. There's a growing divide between the genders. There's growing rates of mental health issues. They're looking ahead at their futures. There's economic instability in their futures. If I was a kid and I was facing all those things and then I went to the average Australian or West Australian school, I'd be thinking, how is this relevant to my life? You know, these are the challenges I'm facing. This is the schooling I'm getting. They're not matching up.
And for your personal growth, from how do you transition between being a school teacher to the person who's looking for facts and identifying stories and then becoming a media journalist? So how does that mindset shift happens, and what was the turning point in your own journey of, you know, questioning yourself probably, or going on a journey to be a, you know, in a way you are an independent journalist?
I mean, I think in some ways it's actually a continuation of the same thing. Because as a teacher, you're taking complex topics, you're trying to work them out for yourself so that you can then explain them simply to someone else. And that's kind of what I'm doing now with, say, the big state TikTok, is I'm looking at what the hell is going on with gas exports. It's a complicated topic. I don't understand the half of it, but I'm learning more as I go. I take that, I try and ask myself, what's really going on here? Okay, how can I explain this to people who are, you know, scrolling their TikTok feed at the end of the day? They might not have the energy or the inclination to look at, you know, pages of reports and to kind of go on these deep dives and try and uncover these things. But they might, you know, be keen to watch me talk about it in a TikTok, and hopefully I can make that kind of funny or kind of interesting and it keeps their attention. Very similar to what you do as a teacher. You're trying to make things interesting for people and distill things down to their essence. So, yeah, I think it's a continuation, really.
How do you, when you started, how do you think about focusing on, why did you pick up the oil and gas specifically as a sector? Or when you talked about the state capture, what does that definition means? Why a state capture is happening right now, or how do you define a state capture? What are the telltale signs for an average person to understand, yes, there is state capture happening or not happening, either ways? Yeah,
so I guess a state capture is where there are particular vested interests who have a huge amount of influence over political institutions. It's not just oil and gas. In the eastern states especially, gambling is another industry that has a large amount of influence. In Western Australia, I think the most dominant industry over our institutions, our political institutions, is oil and gas. You know, the term corruption comes to mind, one you have to be careful throwing around, you know, for legal reasons. Maybe state capture is adjacent to that. So basically, if we look at the oil and gas industry, I think is in Western Australia the strongest example of that. So, okay, let's look at our political parties. The two major political parties, Labor and Liberal. Firstly, both of those receive large donations from the oil and gas industry. Secondly, politicians from both those major parties oftentimes get jobs in that industry after they finish their political term. Former Premier Mark McGowan is an example of that. He's taken various resources industry jobs, including with gas companies. We see it on the other side as well with the Liberals. So that's one of the ways that they've kind of gained influence over those political parties. Media. Ownership of media is a huge thing around the world. In Western Australia, the same interests who own oil and gas also own major media outlets. And so there's another institution that is kind of captured. Then you can go into the kind of the regulators of oil and gas, NOPSEMA, the offshore regulator of oil and gas, stacked with ex-oil and gas workers who used to work in that industry. Same with the EPA. People from the gas industry have been on the Environmental Protection Authority. So these bodies also have this influence. And then there's the way that these oil and gas companies try and make themselves appear like they are necessary and good for ordinary West Australians and our way of life. You know, they put advertising everywhere. They sponsor my favourite footy team, the Fremantle Dockers, is sponsored by Woodside. Woodside sponsors Surf Lifesaving. They sponsor fun runs. They sponsor art festivals. They sponsor all of these things. Meanwhile, what I say is this. These companies are taking, in Western Australia, 90% of our gas and exporting it overseas. That's putting pressure on our domestic gas supply. So that's not good for Western Australians. They're also paying very little in terms of royalties. Now, royalties is something that is kind of a little bit hard to understand, but basically a royalty is a payment for a material. The raw material underneath the ground, that belongs to the state. That doesn't belong to these companies. Same way that if I'm a baker, I've got to go and buy flour to make bread. If I'm an oil and gas company, I should have to pay for the raw material that I'm using. That's a royalty. In Australia, more than half of the gas that is exported, these gas companies don't pay royalties on. That's not giving back to Western Australians or to Australians. And then the third thing is the taxation. These companies get away with paying very little tax because every time the government tries to tax them more, they run these massive big advertising campaigns and they throw around their political weight because they're so well resourced. They can spend so much money on advertising. They can spend so much money on getting their way through lobbying and whatnot. And so to me, those three things, the exports, the royalties and the taxes, are all ways in which these companies are not benefiting us. And yet they spend so much time and money on telling us that we're essential for you. We're essential for West Australians. We're essential for Australians. In my mind, it's propaganda. That's how I would describe it. And it's facilitated by the two major parties, which are both captured by this industry.
People on the other side might say these organizations are bringing jobs, prosperity into the country, to the state, and there's a creation of jobs and wealth for the state, and then it adds to the idea of free markets and adds to the idea of commercialization, and then part of capitalism supports that to lift the average lifestyle or living standard of an individual. So how do you respond to that argument?
Few things there. Firstly, if we want to talk about free markets, the oil and gas industry in Australia is subsidised by the government millions of dollars every year. So to me, that's not free markets. If you believe in free market economies, that doesn't mean subsidising industries. So that's one thing, one part of that. Then to pick up on employment, the oil and gas industry in Western Australia is actually the lowest employing industry by sector. So mining is a big employer, largely iron ore mining, that's a big employer. Oil and gas, though, is actually not particularly labour intensive and employs a small number, less than 1% of Western Australians. Now, one of the things that the oil and gas industry do, that politicians do, is they try and lump mining and oil and gas together. So iron ore, we do get royalties on, it is a big employer. That's a slightly different story. There are some issues there as well, but it's not to the same degree as oil and gas. So, there are many, many, many times more people in Western Australia working in health than there are in oil and gas. There are more people working in arts and recreation in Western Australia than there are in oil and gas. So the jobs argument is a myth. I think there are other industries that we could be relying on economically. Plenty of them. We've got plenty of opportunities here. The oil and gas industry as an export industry is not benefiting us. We're not using the resources. And the other thing, the profits are largely going offshore. Most of these companies are foreign owned. So the profits are going offshore, the gas is going offshore, there's few jobs, there's few royalties, there's few taxes. The economic contribution is massively, massively overstated. That would be my response to that.
From a functioning democracy point of view, one of the key pillars is an independent media. And the media landscape is fairly not that diverse at this stage, or you may pick up few media houses, have different point of view or leanings. You can tell when they are presenting their point of views. So what do you see the role of independent media, or media which can question the facts and then follow the stories, from a point of view of supporting the idea of functioning democracy?
Well, firstly, I just think the state of mainstream media in Western Australia is just absolutely atrocious. You know, I don't know if you've picked up a copy of the West Australian newspaper in recent times. I don't know why most people would. Unfortunately, I kind of force myself to. Professionally, I want to know what's going on in the paper. I want to know what they're running, and every time I do, it just sickens me. It is basically a pamphlet for the oil and gas industry. That's what it's been reduced to. So we've got such dominance of one media company, Seven West in Western Australia. They own the West Australian, they own basically every local newspaper in WA aside from a few, and they own Channel 7. They have such dominance, the other media takes their lead from the West Australian. The ABC is just in a shocking state because they're so scared to put a foot out of line, they're worried about they're going to be political attacks, they're basically censoring themselves. Beyond that, if we're looking at legacy media, mainstream media, there's not much there. There are some good journalists doing good work. The journalists themselves will often do good work, but it's the structural part of it which is just in total disarray. Mm-hmm. So in a situation like that, we desperately need independent media. We need people like you doing what you're doing. I'm trying to contribute in my own way as well. There are others out there. We desperately need people to come along and say, hang on, I'm not so sure about that. Or even just to present another point of view. You know, it doesn't always have to be critiquing and challenging. It can just be, hey, here's a different view that's not going to get picked up on the mainstream media. I think we've also got to be a little bit careful because, you know, journalism is a skill, and I think it's actually an important skill. There's a lot of misinformation out there these days. It's a terrible word, I kind of hate the word, but there are a lot of bad facts on the internet. Like, everyone knows that, right? There's stuff that's true, there's stuff that's not true. It's hard on the internet. Even for, you know, I like to think of myself as fairly savvy. Even for someone who's fairly savvy, it can be hard to know what's real and not real. So what I'd love to see is good independent media that has good fact, you know, good kind of awareness of facts, good fact checking, but isn't also like lecturing people for being wrong all the time. Because I think that's one of the things about fact checking is that it can become a little bit kind of like, no, this is the official narrative, and if you go away from that, then, you know, you can't say that, you can't speak like that. No, let's speak openly, let's put things on the table. Let's also all recognise our own biases and our own points of view. We've all got a point of view. But yeah, let's try and create alternatives and let's try and democratise media as well. You know, everyone's got a point of view, and they should be allowed to share that. We should be able to have open dialogue. I think that's really important. You look at what's happened in the United States. You know, independent media, I think, is a large part of why Donald Trump's won a second term. Politicians in Australia are aware of that. That's probably why they're willing to talk to people like you and I, because they realise, oh, okay, you know, it's not just the kind of these big corporate-owned media companies that we need to be engaging with. It's creators, it's people online.
And on the idea of there are two competing priorities for, you know, you say misinformation, but, you know, if you teach people critical thinking and problem solving, they should be able to. And then if you are adults, people can think and then say, oh, this is not adding up right.
Exactly.
So the competing two priorities is how far do you stop the misinformation, and then how much do you allow freedom of speech?
See, I don't believe in censorship at all. I don't think we should be. I'm fairly hard line on freedom of speech. I think you should basically be able to say what you want.
You're sounding American. I'm a freedom of speech absolutist.
Well, I think freedom of speech is important, but I think also, like, just because you can say something doesn't mean you deserve to be heard.
Yeah.
You know, like, we all have a right to say something, doesn't mean that we all have a right to be heard. And the more of us who have critical thinking, the more we can sort that out for ourselves.
And critical thinking comes from good schooling, good education.
Critical thinking comes from good schooling and good education, and comes, I think, as well from good community in life. and mixing with people of different viewpoints, different ages, different backgrounds, problem solving. Yeah, I think that, yes, education is very important there, but so I think is like strong communities. I think that those are also really important. People are so alienated now. People sit in their rooms, they scroll on their phone, they don't meet people who are older than them or who are younger than them. They don't meet people from different backgrounds. I mean, they still do, but maybe less than they once did. And that to me is a real worry. We shouldn't be divided up into these little bubbles. We should be speaking to each other in community, and that will help us all be more critically minded.
How might we bring people on the extreme end of the spectrum who think politically from a policy point of view very different things, to bring them on a platform to talk to each other rather than completely staying within your own echo chamber, whether you're on the left or the right, wherever you sit. The critical thing is to communicate and should be able to understand each other where they're coming from.
Yeah.
How might we achieve that? Because the echo chambers are the echo chambers in the information age right now, and then people might get into the funnel off through their own social media and through all that, what news they get. So how might we create those platforms so that people can understand each other more or share their views openly?
I think part of it is getting into real life a bit more rather than just learning things online. It's like actually talking to people is one, creating those opportunities. I think another is looking at the things that we agree on, which is one of the reasons that the state capture of the oil and gas stuff is interesting to me. Because I think no matter whether you're far left, far right, or somewhere in the middle, people don't like getting ripped off. So I think finding those issues that we agree on can be a really important thing. And I think a lot of the time what you're going to find is actually that, there's this very small group of wealthy and powerful people who benefit from the way society is right now. But then the rest of us, left, right, in between, are getting ripped off and screwed over in various ways. And so if we can work out what those things that we agree are on, that's a good starting point. And then we can be open to having the debates on the things that we don't agree on. I think a good debate is healthy and good. I think that we shouldn't be putting certain topics or stuff out of the picture or as taboo. But also I think we shouldn't let ourselves get too distracted by culture war issues, I guess. Like, part of the reason that those issues exist is to distract us. The powerful big interests that I'm talking about, they want us fighting over culture war issues rather than looking at what's really going on.
In the upcoming federal election, which is not that far, whether end of April or early May, what are the things you think are critical to be talked about or to be picked up by both and the independents? Because there are quite a few independents coming now for the federal election. So what do you see that landscape evolving?
I mean, I think that the things that independents or any politicians should be looking at and talking about are the things that people care about. And that is things like, the cost of living is a huge one. And the issues I talk about in terms of gas exports connects with that, because those the way that industry is prioritised over ordinary people creates cost of living pressures. Housing, property developers are another group that I kind of want to begin to focus on a bit more in big state, because I think that property developers have a similar type of influence, shall we say, over our government. I think that health and education are important to people, so that's what we should be looking at. I think that you need to look at what are the things that we all care about. We all want the right thing for our children. We all want the right thing for our parents. We all want the right thing for our families. We all want a sense of fairness. I think that's a good kind of fairly universal value, is that people like things to be fair. And I think things in Australia right now are not fair. In terms of gas exports, in terms of the supermarket duopoly, in terms of the gambling industry, in terms of property developers, in terms of some of the rules around investment properties. I think that there's a lot of things where it's just simply not fair, and it doesn't take much to look at that and understand that.
Could you talk more on because one of the issues are being talked about the housing shortage or the gap in the housing market, which creates more demand supply imbalance. If property developers, if you see an interest of a property developer would be typically to build more houses, or bring more supply into it, and that should naturally lead to more reduced housing prices. So what do you see that competing priorities for them and increasing housing prices in the state of WA?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think housing is a complicated issue. I must admit, I feel less confident talking about it than I do talking about the oil and gas, just because I haven't done as much of the research. So I don't want to pretend I know a lot about something when I don't. But what I do see is that the property developers operate in a similar way to the oil and gas industry, where they make political donations, have these cozy relationships, and then kind of get what they want. I do think we need to find ways to build more houses, like we desperately need them. I think as well, though, there are a lot of houses sitting there empty that are second, third, fourth, fifth investment properties. That to me doesn't seem right. You know, it seems to me that if you're in a society, one of the basic things of a society is that people deserve somewhere to live. It shouldn't be out of the question for them. You know, it's kind of out of the question probably for me that I'm going to own a house maybe ever in my lifetime. It shouldn't be like that. I think that the government has a role here as well in terms of social housing. When I used to live in the Pilbara, I saw that a lot of the social housing was just in a terrible condition, sat there empty, boarded up for years. Now, I know there's issues with labour and getting labour to work on those houses, but that's another thing about the oil and gas industry is that it actually sometimes diverts workers because they're constructing their projects. It diverts workers from constructing houses to constructing these oil and gas these oil and gas projects. So, look, I think housing is really complicated. I think there's probably people who are better informed than me to talk about that one. Yeah. But I want to learn more about it, and when I do, I'll share it through Big State with my audience.
And the whole premise is we all are on a learning curve, and we should not be penalizing our politicians or leaders having a point of view today and it changing afterwards, because
I agree.
Every person is on a learning curve.
Yes.
As you know more, you change.
I love changing my mind.
Because if you don't change, I'm very different about what I was when I was 21 years of age. The way I think and the way I believe.
Thank God. Yeah.
And if you can't be the same person across your life, you are evolving, you get more information, capturing more information, you have more experiences, you're meeting more people, so you change your point of views with time. And we should not be penalizing any politician to change the point of view for the right.
Yeah.
You know, if they can back that up from a factual point of view and in their own experience, that's the most important thing, that they are evolving. From a point of view of the new wave of community independence they are mushrooming everywhere in the country, and this big wave happening in the state election. There is one community independent which I think very fairly close to being called upon to win, between Simon McGurk and the lady
Kate Hewlett.
Yes,
that's where I live down in Fremantle. That's
a different language. And for the federal election in the state, we have three independents: one for the seat of Moore, one for the seat of Curtin, which is Kate Cheney, and then one for the seat of Forest. So there are three community independents in the Western Australia. So how do you see that impacting, one, the balance of power, the way people think, and then we are coming out of the state election? So how do you see all of that mix happening?
Look, I think it's pretty interesting because, you know, you look at the state election that we've just had, and yes, it was a big win for Labor. It's hard to deny that. But also, there was an 18% swing away from Labor, and it didn't go to the Liberal Party. It went to the Greens, to independents, to minor parties. And that, to me, is a good thing. I don't like to say who I vote for or who I support, or I don't like to endorse political parties or politicians because A, I'm trying to focus on the issues and not get too caught up in the kind of political ins and outs. But B, I know that as soon as I do that, it will turn some people off who might otherwise actually be interested in my ideas. So I don't like to say, I support this party or this politician or this. But what I will say is this. I hope we have a minority government. People think that a minority government is maybe a bad thing. It's unstable or insecure. I think it's a great thing to have more voices and more people, more perspectives shaping the legislation that we have. So I hope that neither major party get enough seats to have a majority government. I hope that there's a crossbench that will maybe be able to provide a bit of a buffer to some of the ways in which the major parties just govern in the interests of big business instead of ordinary people. I think it's a good thing that there are choices and that people have quite a number of choices. I think it's a good thing that people are getting involved in democracy in their own local area. I think that the major parties are only going to continue losing power. There's going to be more independents, minor parties of different stripes arising. I think that's a good thing. That's often how it is in European democracies. I think that we could benefit from that here. And one of my goals really is to break down the power of the two major parties. There are differences between those two parties, sure, but there's a lot of things that are the same between them. And I just think one of those key similarities is that they pander all the time to big, powerful industries like oil and gas.
Mm-hmm. Within the minor parties, there's another subset of minor parties. So one is community independence, but the other are, they loosely label them as freedom-based parties, like Clive Palmer's Trumpet, or like One Nation, like People First.
Yeah.
There are quite a few smaller minor parties. And then what do you see them as? What role do they play in functioning democracy?
I think they're part of that bigger picture that I'm talking about, in that they are alternatives that people can go to. I mean, I think we always have to look carefully at what's behind these things. You know, Clive Palmer, for instance, is someone who I instinctively just don't trust, because I do kind of think that he is looking after his own business interests, really, more than being a good faith political actor. So that's one person who I'm happy to kind of criticise. I think that, I think I welcome a diversity of views, and I welcome alternatives to the two-party system. You know, and I think that that's happening on both sides of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. I was disappointed when I saw Pauline Hanson having a meal with Gina Reinhardt on holiday. That to me suggested that some of the statements she's made maybe aren't necessarily backed up. I mean, look, again, people should be able to talk to who they want to talk to, but that rings alarm bells for me when she's going on holiday with one of the wealthiest mining billionaires in Australia, who, again, I think doesn't have the interests of Western Australians at heart.
Mm-hmm. You talked about that there might be minority governments, and the balance of power will be somewhere between the centre or the independents. How do you see that the theatre of democracy laying out in the next 3 years? How do we pick up a prime minister? How do you share portfolios? And what negotiation power do you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's happened before, right? We've had minority governments before, and actually, like, they're often able to pass quite a bit of legislation. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that if and I think when, I think it will happen this election, that there will be a minority government, then it'll be very interesting to see what happens, because whatever party's in power then has a choice. It's, okay, do I double down into the way that I'm going now and govern in the interest of big business? And if that's what they're going to do, those two major parties will just probably work together. Or do they say, okay, clearly the people of Australia want something different than what we're offering. We're going to work with the crossbench and we're going to deliver people what they want. That might make big business unhappy, but we have a mandate to do that because people have voted for it. That's going to be the big test. Say if it's Labor and government, it might be, it might not. For the sake of convenience, I'll just talk about Labor. If Labor go down that first path and just kind of double down, serving the interests of big business, work with the Liberals, people are just going to get more disengaged and they're going to get smashed at the next election. Same if it's the Liberal Party. Those parties have a kind of a choice. Do they keep going down the path they're going down? And there's a trend since World War II that the major parties are losing their share of the vote. Are they going to keep going down that path? Or are they going to kind of wake up and see the signs and say, okay, we've got to do this differently? I have a theory about which way it's going to go, but I don't want to be too cynical. At the end of the day, what I want to see is the interests of Australians put first. So I don't really mind who does that, just someone please do it. I don't have a lot of faith in the major parties to do it.
As you said, to engage people in the political process, part of the solution or part of the answer is which is to bring people along and then give them more knowledge and information to take decisions and have more options for them when they go to vote. How do you engage majority of the country in the political process and is to do more research on who they vote for and why they're voting for rather than just... So how do you solve that disengagement to becoming more engaged in the political process?
I think part of it is breaking down the power of the mainstream media, which is what we're trying to do. Well, at least what I'm trying to do. I don't want to speak for you. I think part of it is speaking to people's everyday concerns, speaking to them in their communities, which is one of the things I think the community independents do, is that they're from the community, they're speaking to people in the community. It's like, rather than being asked to vote for someone who's parachuted in from somewhere else by the major parties, it's like, oh, I know that person, they're like my doctor, or they're, someone who I know because they run a shop. I think that's a kind of good thing, and I think the rest of the political spectrum could learn from that. But yeah, I think it's also just providing like good options, because it's very easy to get cynical and disengaged because people don't trust politicians. Well, let's get some politicians we can trust. They're out there. So I think if we have ordinary people getting in there, getting amongst it, hopefully that can inspire some positive change. And I think, that's part of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to explain complex things to people in simple terms so that they can make informed decisions.
We'll have an election in the next fortnights. If anybody locally, they want to do research on their local politician, on all the parties, what are the three things they should be looking for? Yeah,
good question. I'd be probably going to talk to them, would be my first thing, is trying to actually have a conversation with them. If you can't get a conversation with them, that's maybe the first sign that they're not worth voting for. But ask them, what will you do to stand up to the oil and gas industry? That's a pretty big question, I think. And then I guess think about what other issues you care about. For me, it might be, okay, what are you going to do to... Another issue I care about is foreign affairs and AUKUS. I think it's terrible that we're sending all this money to get these submarines which we're never going to get. I think that we're giving up our sovereignty to the United States. I'd ask the representative about that. Do you think the AUKUS deal is a good deal? And do you think it's a good idea that we are basically just giving billions of dollars to the US when the US, Donald Trump doesn't even know what AUKUS is, a journalist asked him the other day. And he was like, what's that? So I think that that's another thing I'd be asking about. And then the third thing for me personally would probably be housing. What are you going to do on housing? And then I guess it's just about evaluating those positions and using that critical thinking and seeing how they stack up. Yeah.
What do you feel about the idea of strong defence to keep us geopolitically independent, a strong defense to support the idea of sovereignty, a strong defense from a point of view of that, nobody can take us over in any near time in the future. What do you feel about that? And as you have seen, in the recruitment of people in the defense forces have come down, or if you would see the number of defense forces we have per capita of the population, that's also have come down in the recent years. So what do you see those trends reflective of?
I mean, look, I think, defence is obviously important. We live in an increasingly unstable world. To me, the biggest issue with our defence is a strategic one, which is that we are aligning ourselves with US interests in a time where the US is increasingly unstable and in trouble, I would say. Some people might disagree with that, but I think that if you look at the US, as a historical force, it is declining and it's becoming more erratic and unpredictable. So for us to tie ourselves for decades to come to the US when there seems to be on the horizon conflict between the US and China is a bad idea. I think that we run the risk of antagonising China, making ourselves a target, when we should be trying to stand independent as Australia. We've recently had Chinese warships off the coast. I don't blame the Chinese for wanting to do that. Surely it makes sense. If there's going to be US military bases in Australia, surely it makes sense for them to come in open waters and to check it out. I think that the AUKUS deal is a terrible deal. It's been a good deal for Scott Morrison. He's picked up a consultancy gig in the US, well-paid consultancy gig over it. But for the people of Australia, I don't think it's a good deal. I don't think we're ever going to get these nuclear submarines that we've paid for, but we've started paying for them. I don't think it's viable. I think it's strategically foolish, and I think that we're turning ourselves into a target.
But from a defense point of view, people have argued, or people will argue, that we have always had allies, and when you have allies, you become more stronger, and we still are independent, but you have allies when you go on. If there is a war to be waged, you work together, you have allies, and there are people who are similar in similar values. The way US is democratic, we are democratic.
But I think having allies is fine, but I think that this AUKUS deal goes beyond having allies. I think it's giving the US a degree of influence and control over our defence, which is unacceptable, and it's giving the US a presence physically here that is too much. I think, of course, there are natural alliances that we have with other countries, that we've been allies with for a long time. But I just think that we need to be careful not to give away our sovereignty rather than find allies. Like there's a fine line there, right, between becoming a vassal state for the US and being an ally of the US. And look, I think the future looks, fairly scary geopolitically. I think that it doesn't help for us to basically be at the beck and call of the United States, a global superpower which is becoming increasingly erratic.
What do you think about nuclear power, as in nuclear weapons, which is the next level of nuclear power to nuclear weapons? And in terms of, if you talk about geopolitical stability, there are two ways to manage that you don't need to spend too much money, and then you have allies who have those resources. The other way around is, you go on, because a good offense is a good defense sometimes. You need to show your muscle, as our neighbors would run annual events and they would showcase their muscle through by showcasing the missiles and everything they have. So it's on all show, and it's part of that I have that in my artillery. So what strategy and then strategy should change and evolve as a country matures and evolves? So where do you think we are sitting in terms of our evolution, our maturity, in terms of yes, we need to have allies and friends, but we need to be independent, should be able to defend our own borders by ourselves without any allyship?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see us have diplomatic relationships, as with China as well. Like, I think that
Why would you not? Because we do a lot of trade with them.
Exactly, yeah. We have a natural geographic partnership with them, which I think that we should not kind of jeopardise or antagonise that. In terms of the nuclear question, nuclear warfare is very frightening to me. I think that that's a frightening prospect, one that, one that I think we're not as concerned about as we should be. I'd like to see nuclear non-proliferation globally. I know that's a very difficult thing to do, especially with the kind of current state of the world. So, look, I think nuclear war is a nightmarish scenario. And I think fundamentally I am a peace-loving person. I'd prefer the world to be less armed than more armed in general. Not that means that we that we totally abandon the idea of defence. I think that would be foolish. But I think as a kind of geopolitical thing to work towards, I think nuclear non-proliferation would be good. And then in terms of nuclear power, it's a pretty interesting one. I mean, they're kind of different but related questions. The thing about the nuclear plan that Peter Dutton and the Liberals are spruiking at the moment is, I just don't see that as a viable, practical plan. If you come to me with a viable, practical plan for nuclear, I'll have a look at it, consider it. But the plan that they're presenting doesn't seem realistic. Seems like it will be way over budget from what they're saying. And to me, actually looks more like a cover for oil and gas than it does a serious energy plan. They're also talking about this being publicly owned, which is a very strange thing for the Liberal Party, for a kind of economically conservative party to be proposing. Supposedly a party of free markets to be saying, oh, we want to build these publicly owned nuclear reactors. I don't think they're serious. And I think that they're using that as a way to say, oh yeah, further down the road, we'll sort out nuclear power. For now, let's just keep going with the gas industry. Let's keep giving them whatever they want. Let's keep letting them expand. To me, it seems like a Trojan horse for the gas industry, rather than a realistic energy policy, maintaining our energy future, securing that.
On the defence side, that as I talked about earlier, that it's more challenging to have more recruits join the defence forces because we don't force people to have national service. And then they're reducing numbers. And so what do you see culturally has changed in the country, which has reduced the challenge of recruitment is a much bigger challenge? Yeah,
I mean, I think people are just less trusting of authority than they once were, which ties into a lot of the kind of threads we've been talking about here. And I actually don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that in the 20th century, a lot of young men from all different countries lost their lives fighting for things that they didn't really understand or believe in. And I don't think that was a good thing. So I think that, questions of defence are tricky, for sure, especially for a country like Australia. I think that diplomacy first is a good way of doing it, while also maintaining some kind of strength to our defence force. And I think, how do you solve the problem of people not wanting to sign up? Well, you give them something worth signing up for. You give them something inspiring. You inspire them with a vision of who we are and what we are, which I just don't think we have in this country. I think that people are disenchanted and disenfranchised. I think that there are good reasons for that. And I think that, we're not a mature nation, I don't think. We've still got a long way to go.
In the last election in the UK, the Conservative Party had a policy of a compulsory national service or volunteer work for, I think it was a year or year and a half types. Do you think if that's a policy to be brought here in Australia to support the defence, will that work and how will that fly?
I just don't think it would fly. Can you imagine? I just don't think that. I think it would be incredibly unpopular, and I think that whoever proposed that would not win the election, as the Conservatives didn't win the election in the UK either. Be interesting to look at the voting figures amongst young people and see how they polled there. But I think we're in a different world than we were back in the time where countries like Australia had compulsory military service. I think in some ways we're in a better world, in some ways we're in a worse world. I think that young people increasingly just feel disconnected and disenfranchised, and there's good reason for that. And it's up to politicians to give them reasons to feel inspired and to feel connected. So
how would the young people feel when there was social media ban access? So some parties have different views, but you have banned social media, or you have to have some form of ID to prove that you're of that age.
Yeah.
And you have to provide that ID proof to, in some way or form, somebody has to justify all those things.
Social media ban for under 16, I think, is one of the dumbest policies that the major parties have come up with in recent times. I think it sounds good on paper because people are worried for good reason about social media. There are risks and dangers to social media, sure. But banning it for under 16s, I think, A, is impractical. How are you going to enforce that? That would involve very difficult technological things to do. Any 16-year-old who is at least a little bit savvy on the computer is going to work out how to get around that. You use a VPN, simple, problem solved. If they ban VPNs, then that's infringing on everyone's rights to digital privacy. So A, I just don't think they're going to be able to enforce it. B, if they start doing ID checks, I don't want to give my ID to, ByteDance, who own TikTok, Chinese company, or Meta, who own Facebook, American company,
or
Microsoft, or Google, or any of them. They know enough about me already. I don't want to give them any more information than I already give them. So sharing ID to sign up for social media, I think if that happens, a lot of people are going to have a real problem with that, including parents of under 16.
Young people are okay to give ID when they walk into in Perth, if you are a young person and you are frequenting bars.
Yeah, well, I hate those scanners.
They scanned your ID proofs and then they take a picture of you and the ID.
Exactly. I don't like that either. That's bad as well. But I think to do that on a digital scale is, to everyone who's signed up to social media, is even worse. I think as well, what the government have to remember, what the major parties both have to remember, is the kids who are under 16 now, who are getting banned from social media, some of them will be old enough to vote come the next federal election. And so it's only going to reinforce this disenchantment, dissatisfaction that those young people already have with government and with established political parties. So they're digging their own grave. The Labor Party, the Liberal Party are digging their own grave through legislation like this.
We have talked about, you have talked about two actors. One is the big organizations, big corporates. You have talked about the political class, and one thing which probably the third angle of the triangle is the bureaucratic class. So people assume, whereas the bureaucratic class is more permanent and long term, whereas political class is more transient, 3 years or 4 years type longevity. So who is running the country?
Who is running the country? Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, those groups all have some degree of power, right? I mean, I think that currently, in our current system, it's the corporate class that have the real power. I think that a good public service is actually very important. I don't kind of agree with the Elon Musk style culling of public servants. I don't think that that's a good way to kind of deal with problems that we face. It has to be a good public service with good leadership. It has to be well equipped to do their job, and it has to be. I mean, I think with the public service, it's people who are getting on with doing a job. You don't want it to be kind of political actors who have strong political associations.
Public servants are fairly paid well in comparison to other similar jobs, but there is also a big dependency on consulting companies, consulting projects. So we have outsourced a part of the probably the decision making or part of the risk taking. That this is a project I want the government to give me an advice on. So okay, I can do the decision, but I don't want to get the blame on myself. Let's transfer the risk from us to probably a third party, which is a consulting business. And they will come and do their own review and research and give us feedback. So how do you see the role of consulting businesses, which are private entities, giving advice to the state or the the governments?
There's been various scandals, right, with consulting firms in Australia, and I think that privatisation in general does kind of worry me. I think that there is a role for a strong public sector. I think that the state election that we've just had is actually a really interesting example of that, because for the first time, the WA Electoral Commission outsourced the running of the election to a private firm, a firm based in Singapore. And what happened? Ballot shortages, people, apparently a Labor MP, their name was missing from the electoral roll. We had all kinds of problems at polling booths. The counting has had all kinds of problems and has been incredibly slow. And that's the first time that the voting in WA election has been privatised. So I think that's a pretty good example of, for some things, why privatisation doesn't actually work. By the way, another interesting thing that just came out in the media today, that firm, which they outsourced the election to, made donations, fairly large donations, to the WA Labor Party in the last year or so before the election, which to me, again, seems like, maybe not how our political system should be working. So that's just one example where I think that privatisation can be, not the right thing. And these big consulting firms, I just have a distrust of that, kind of fairly instinctively. Also, the whole idea of consulting, I don't know, I've never really understood what the hell that even means. Like, consulting to me seems like some kind of black magic. I don't know. I reckon there's a bit of a raud of some kind going on there. Okay.
So my concluding question to you is on the idea of the voting, and then is the next step from voting physically to digital voting?
Oh, that's a good question. That's an interesting
because in this one, the state election, there is a bit of delays happening in terms of counting the voting.
Yeah.
So
look, I'm old-fashioned. I like going to vote. It feels like an important ritual, an important democratic ritual. If I was just sitting on the couch, opening up my phone and ticking a box, I probably would feel less connected, I think, to the community and to the democracy. I think as well there would be a whole heap of practical issues that would come up with digital voting around data and around hacking and whatnot. That sounds like a can of worms. Funnily enough, what do I do with my time? I make TikToks and I make podcasts, but I actually think we all need to get offline a little bit more. And I'm glad that I get to go, line up, talk to people, go to the local school or the local church or whatever, and put my numbers next to my piece of paper. I would be sad to lose that. I just think they need to run the election better. I think that they need to not outsource it, and they need to do a good job. I mean, the WA Electoral Commission really, they do other things as well, but their main job, they've got to do it once every 4 years. Come on, guys, let's sort it out. So is that an example of the kind of erosion of democracy in Australia or in the kind of Western world? Maybe. I think we need more democracy, not less. Yeah.
I think I have another one for you, which is around the idea of compulsory voting.
Yes.
And typically, on average, in Western democracies like UK, you have more than 80% of natural voting without being compulsory. 80% of the people come out to vote, and then we have achieved more than that number by compulsory voting. And naturally, people have a habit of going out to vote. As you said, you would want to vote. So, what do you think? Are we mature enough to move away from compulsory voting to voluntary voting so that people can do their own research and who are keen and interested are involved?
Yeah.
Or should stick with compulsory voting because it has worked for us? Why change if it's working?
Yeah, I see two sides to this, because on the one hand, I don't really like telling people what they should do. So if people don't want to vote,
And fine you.
yeah, exactly. That seems like that gives me a little bit of discomfort. But at the same time, I do think compulsory voting does make people more engaged in the political process. I think it's really good that we have such a high voter turnout, and I think it would be a shame, I guess, to lose that. I think that that's something that actually helps us in Australia to keep our politicians on their toes a little bit, and it means that there's something good behind that, which is that we value everyone and everyone's point of view. We're not trying to exclude people. You can walk in if you like, and you can write whatever you want on your ballot. So you don't actually have to vote. You just have to submit a ballot. Now, I take the point that, why should I have to rock up and do that if I don't want to? But I do think that I think we're lucky in Australia. I think that the preferential voting is also a really good system. I'm so glad we have that. That allows us to not go down, say, some of the same paths that the US, the UK go down. So yeah, look, I think we're lucky here. We have a good democracy. Let's make the most of it. Let's get big money, big business out of it, and let's have more democracy. Let's give people what they want. Government for the people, by the people. That's what democracy is, and I want more of that.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time, and I appreciate what you do.
Thank you. Cheers.